So, hi everybody, good to be here. Nick and I are in the middle of harvest. Dave's here. Oh my goodness. What a treat. What a treat. Um, yeah, and also, I know a lot of people are listening in their car or listening at work or whatever. So if you can't turn your camera on, I totally understand. But it's really nice to see some faces and feel like I'm not just talking into the void. Um, So yeah, I'll just give you a quick harvest update. Nick and I in Guatemala are actually a good chunk of the way through our harvest. I would say about a third of the way. By the end of the next week, I think we hope to be about halfway through. And it's been way more condensed than last year. We've had a lot more coffee coming in just back to back. Usually we try to not work on Sundays and not pick on Sundays so that Monday is kind of a free day. But for the last 3 weeks, we've had coffee every Sunday. So it's just been nonstop every single day. That partly has to do with some other things that I shared where we had a lot of rain when we shouldn't have had rain and a lot of cold when it shouldn't have been cold. And so it, again, compressed that ripening window. And the rain not only impacted us on the patio to be able to dry and get stuff off of the patio to be able to put in new coffee. So that was also delayed, but it affected a lot of the coffee that had to come off the tree. So that would have maybe left it there a little bit longer. It had to come off. So we had kind of a bottleneck on two ends. We had a lot of coffee coming in and nowhere to put it on the patio because nothing was drying. So that led to really thick layers on the patio and lots of prayers. And we're getting through it now. But it's just been a really different year, a different year than what I've been used to and what I've been kind of hearing from others. Yeah, I just wanted to give you that little quick update. And then whoever is here, we have some questions from Paulo, who's a regular, and he's not able to be with us today because he's busy. So he left his questions, but I'm going to leave those for a little bit later and take questions from people that are here. If you guys have anything that you want to chat about or tell me about.
Good morning, everybody. This is David
Hi, David.
from
Welcome.
the Marley Estate. First time guest. We'll be seeing actually you at the camp on Sunday evening. So might be Monday morning by the time I get there.
That's right. And you're in
Um,
Panama, right?
we're in Panama, Boquete. Uh, we're similar harvest to you. Um, we're having a lot of Seco dry coffee come in addition to um, the beans, and our workers are they'll pick out the pinton from there, and then we float the coffee, the natural. But we're having a lot of Seco that comes off, and usually we sell a lot of the Seco when it's not that Seco into local market, but they won't take it now because it's too dry and too much of it. So we've been doing some fermentation of it, putting it into tanks, adding yeast to it, let it sit for a week, and then pulp it afterwards, after it comes out of the tank, and then putting it on the beds. And it's just guesswork this time. I have no idea if it's going to turn out well or not. This is going to be a first for us. So
That's really interesting.
I don't know
So
if we want to comment any of the conversation that way, but that's what's happening with us too.
no, thank you for that. That's another thing that we regularly do is sometimes when I know who's here, I'll pick on people to give us harvest updates. I usually pick on Lowell and Honduras to give us a harvest update. Sometimes I pick on Jack, but Jack, I don't think you're in Colombia right now. But that's really helpful to hear because we are also having a lot of dried coffee. That's from very strong winds that it just seems to be drying up on the cherry. So usually I would see a lot more dry cherry at the end of the season when things are overripe and things are really dried out. And now we're getting a lot of dried cherry right in the beginning. So it's very it's a little upside down to have this much dried coffee in the beginning. So I think your instinct to rehydrate, kind of like plump up that coffee to be able to soften it, to be able to pulp it is a really good instinct. And here where I'm at, there is still kind of a market for that coffee, so it really just gets floated away and sold. But if I had to do something with it, I think that's a really good option. So I'll be curious to get your update on how that's tasting. How long are you soaking it and leaving it for with fermentation?
We're leaving it for about a week, 7 days.
Okay, and is that just because of how? Is there a reason for the 7 days? Does it take that long?
Well, it's in a cooler wooded area under cover shade, and we put them in tanks with air traps, but and cover it with water. Um, I don't have a I don't have a reason for 7 days other than God created the heavens and earth in 7 days. So
Okay.
it sounds like a good number of days. Um,
Okay.
but I use one of the uh, intenso yeasts with it during that time period, and sometimes I'm also combining it with last year's cascara
Okay.
that I've stored to add sugars to it, so the yeast has extra stuff to work on.
Yeah.
So
So that's what I was going to caution. I like to do shorter fermentations. I like to do 36, 48-hour fermentations kind of for turnover because we're in a high volume place, but also because coffee fermentations aren't meant to be so long. And so a lot of times when we're not adding nutrients, the yeast can get stressed, and doing an extra long fermentation will kind of just stress out the yeast, and then you'll get some kind of negative aromas and negative effects instead of the positive ones. So yeast are kind of like, like humans, when we get stressed, we sweat and we don't smell good. So the yeast, if they easily run out of nitrogen and other nutrients, it's not just sugar, then you can get some of the like sulfur compounds. So I've smelled fermentations that smell like onions and cheesy feet and something really unpleasant when you're supposed to be getting, cherries and raspberries and these really beautiful jasmine floral flavors. Aromas. So just keep an eye on that. I would definitely keep smelling your fermentation, daily, maybe twice a day to see how it's smelling, because you can really smell the stress. You will smell the sulfur compounds coming off of the yeast, and that can let you know that maybe you don't need to go so long. So that's another thing with wine fermentations and beer fermentations, is because they are longer. A wine fermentation is 10 days. White wine fermentation can be 3 weeks. The yeast can't go that long without getting kind of replenished. So there's usually multiple nutrient additions to the fermentation tank. So for most coffee producers, it's like the cost of yeast is already a burden. It's already, an extra input that having to double the cost by adding nutrients with your yeast is, an extra burden. So I try to avoid needing to add that extra nutrition by keeping your fermentation kind of short. But again, this is kind of, your coffee it's easy to experiment on this coffee. So I think it's worth a shot. It's worth a trial. But I think you might get better results if you like this, try to get the same results in 4 days. And then if you like that, try to get the same results in 2 days. Because I think you also have less opportunity for something to go wrong. Like your window is shortened. So if your temperature changes, if, I don't know, less chance for contamination too. So I think long fermentations are attractive because they sound interesting. But for microbiology, like for kind of risk reduction, I still really like short fermentations. So anyway, keep us posted on how those turn out.
all right, it's some of that is getting close to being dried, uh, so it smells nice.
Good.
It has that nice, I call it a woody smell on the bed with the parchment and a little bit of cascara in there. It has a nice herbal, more woody
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you're
aroma.
measuring, like keeping track of temperature, keeping track of pH?
Uh, nope, don't do any of that.
Okay.
Probably need to. Something we'll learn next week, right?
Something you'll learn next week. Well, the reason you would is to know if it worked, can I do it again? And if you're not measuring anything and it worked, you won't know if you're able to do it again and get those really great results.
Okay.
So that's why it's just helpful to keep track of some of those parameters. But yes, you'll see all of that next week. All right. Does anyone else who's got their video on want to give us an update or say hi or introduce yourself to the group?
I can say hi. This is my first time. I'm Christine, and I just started planting coffee in Kenya. Right now I'm in Maryland, but I haven't harvested anything yet, so I'm here to learn. And I also want to experiment with, you know, all the different um, processes and see if I can produce something different than what everybody else is producing in Kenya right now.
So, do you have a family farm in Kenya, or are you kind of starting something new project from scratch?
So it actually used to be a coffee farm, and then 50 years ago, they uprooted all the coffee. So I'm starting from scratch now in the same spot, though.
Cool. And
But
where
it's a different area than the typical Kenya growing areas.
where is it?
It's in Taita. I don't know if you know where that is.
No.
It's close to the border with Tanzania.
Okay.
And actually, it's the first place where coffee was grown in Kenya. So it's high altitude, it's up in the hills, and coffee grows well there.
That's awesome. So, where did you get your plants, your genetic material?
Um, from through the Kenya Coffee uh, Board, the Coffee Board of Kenya, they referred me to a farmer who had seedlings of Roro 11. So that's what I've grown.
Excellent. So, when are you going to go back to Kenya?
I go back every 3 months. So I just came back on Sunday and I'll be back in March.
That's excellent. When Nick and I were doing our fermentation camp in Kenya, we were in the Rift Valley. So we only got to
Mhm.
experience a little bit of Nairobi. We were in Nairobi for a week, and then we were um, in the Rift Valley, and then our time was too short. We would love to go back to Kenya, and actually, I think we're drinking Kenyan coffee right now. We were able to get
Oh.
some of that with the intenso yeast that David was mentioning.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, thanks for joining, Christine.
Okay, right. Well, I also want to know, are you going to have another workshop after this one in January? Because I may
No,
get that.
we are taking a break from the fermentation workshops to do some other projects. So we will have them again at some point. But right now, yeah, definitely taking a pause. Unless you want to hop on a plane, Maryland to Guatemala. It's not that far
Not far.
compared to Kenya to Guatemala.
Yeah.
No, so yeah, so right now we don't have any future dates for workshops. But that's one of the things that we're taking a pause for from the fermentation workshops is to try to develop maybe some digital material, develop more kind of written material for people that can't make it to the workshops. It's some of those things that, we've been asked for that we've never been able to work on because we're just workshop after workshop after workshop. So
Hmm.
that's yeah.
Okay.
But this community is still a really great place to learn, to have, to like learn from other producers and to learn from other people that are doing a lot of these experiments. So it's really nice that you can kind of, one of the things that I really like to teach in the workshops is let's not learn from the things that we know don't work. Lots of people have tried these experiments, and I think that's something that a producer who's even a longtime producer that's been maybe more in commercial coffee and wants to move into specialty, there's so many things you can try. There's so many different combinations of processing, and it can be really overwhelming. And so, and not everything works. And to be able to learn from other people's experience and to know what doesn't work so that you can start to eliminate and just focus on maybe the 5 trials that make sense versus other producers who are like, 5 years in and they're still doing trials and they still don't feel like they have a protocol that works. So that's something that we focus on in the workshops and then also in these kind of forums to share what people are trying. And that's why I was mentioning to David earlier that keeping notes, keeping track of your temperatures and your pHs and your aromas really helps kind of eliminate, okay, that didn't work. I don't have to do that again. But, or maybe it did work. And how do I repeat that on a bigger scale. It worked really great with 10 kilos. How do I get 10 bags of it because somebody asked me for it? So being able to scale and reproduce is, without those numbers, is really difficult.
Okay. Okay.
Cool. Paolo's question. Okay. So I'm just going to read Paolo's question, and it's actually in the chat if you want to follow along. There's a kind of a chat underneath this office hours. And he says, I'd like to ask a follow-up question to something that he raised before Christmas. He says, complex processing methods with long fermentation seem to deeply alter the coffee bean, even visually. But what exactly happens to its structure? Is there a difference between long fermentation in cherry versus in pulped beans? And what changes at the cellular level? If there's any research on this, I'd love to read it. I'm curious whether these changes can impact the coffee's shelf life. As I mentioned before, in some cases, there seems to be a sudden drop in aromatic quality, but this doesn't always happen. Another mystery. So this is kind of bringing together a lot of topics that we've been talking about, long fermentation, shelf life, the structure, the internal structure. We talked about this, I think either in the last one or two sessions ago, where I shared research with you from Flavio Borem, where he was looking at the internal structure of the enzymatic activity in germination of the seeds and how the germination affects the long-term shelf life of the coffee. So I think that much of that research is newer, and even a lot of the things that Flavio's been working on isn't fully published yet, which is why I've been waiting to have him on the podcast. There's some things that he can't really talk about until it's published. So I don't have anything off the top of my head to give you guys to read. But where I think we have some guidance on this is that anything that affects the cellular structure has to affect shelf life, right? Those two things have to go together. And whether it affects it positively or negatively, I'm not sure, but my guess is towards the negative. If we're affecting the cellular structure, I'm more imagining kind of a breakdown of the structure where some of the pictures that I showed you last time were, you've got our kind of matrix of our seed, and anything that we do to damage that matrix is kind of allowing aromas to volatilize. It's it's kind of exposing other compounds to be oxidized, to then become rancid, to then kind of lead to fading. So I think any processing that is very brutal and hard on the seed, I think leads to that kind of loss of integrity and therefore fading. So I think we see that a lot in these competition coffees where you have a really intense and brutal processing, which I think you can have that really loud and very what's the word I'm looking for? Just intense flavors, because maybe some part of the cellular structure has been compromised. So a lot of those things are more available immediately. So the coffee tastes immediately great, and then fades over time because it kind of just gave off all of its kind of aromas and compounds in the beginning, and there wasn't much left, for 6 months later, 8 months later, and maybe not even that long. I think Paolo was saying that, in 3 months, he's seen some of these coffees completely change. And then I think also that difference is greater where we have our baseline intensity. And when we go up so much higher, when you go down, that difference, that delta is bigger. And so it seems like it fell even more when maybe it's a normal amount of fading. But because we've raised the beginning so high, that difference feels more dramatic. So that's just to say that I think that is a kind of a danger with these competition coffees where they're pushed to extremes. So they taste great immediately. Part of the reason I think is because we're kind of changing the structure and just kind of having these bursts of flavor, but then they don't last. So when somebody wants to create a production level lot of something that's a competition protocol, it doesn't really translate very well because, competition needs to be really good on this one day and wow everybody. But a production lot needs to be good for 6 months, 12 months if it's, traveling long distances and needs to be kept in a warehouse for a long time or kind of moved around. So I think one of those is just something to be cautious of, that a lot of these competition protocols may not translate to commercial scale. And that whatever we're doing to pump up the intensity is going to have some effect on the shelf life because we are messing with the structure. So what I was sharing last time that I think Paolo was referring to is enzymatic activity due to germination. And what Dr. Borem's research out of Brazil was showing is that wash coffees have a lot more enzymatic activity, and that this enzymatic activity is kind of protective of the seed, where these wash coffees have a longer shelf life than the natural coffees. And this enzymatic activity has to do with kind of the seed germinating and turning on. And when the seed is, when we're doing cherries, when we're doing dry process, the seed still has all of its protective layers. You've got the seed with the parchment, with the mucilage, with the cascara, like it's all protected. So having those tissues on there gives the seed a signal that it's not a good time to germinate. If you try to germinate right now, you've got all of these barriers, so don't do it. So there's this biofeedback to the seed to not germinate when it's, in its whole fruit form. And therefore, when we're processing wash coffees or natural coffees, of course, they're going to be different internally. The structure is different because the seed is getting different signals. So when we're looking at wash coffees, the layers are off, the cascara is off, the mucilage is being dissolved, and you're usually in a high moisture content, either because you're in a submerged fermentation or because you have all of the juices kind of around there. So the seed gets the signal, it's okay to germinate. It's a good time to germinate. And so these enzymatic activities, can start to happen. The seed can prepare to become a new plant because I have moisture available. I don't have my physical barriers. I can become a new plant. Now, I've talked to Farhan about this, Christopher Farhan, because we want to almost catch the seed, because you want some germination because it means your seed is kind of awake, and it's those carbohydrates that are kind of locked in the seed become available, because if the seed is going to become a new plant, then we want those carbohydrates to be available to do that. Versus if the seed is kind of dormant, then those carbohydrates are locked into the seed. So we want it to become available. We want it to wake up, but we also don't want it to become a new plant. So we want to be able to start some of those metabolic processes in the seed, but also kind of cut them off before you get into a new plant, because then those carbohydrates will be gone. And when you're roasting, you might be roasting an empty bean. There's nothing more of substance there because the seed consumed it for its own purposes. So I think that kind of catching it in that Goldilocks window is going to be an interesting thing. I don't know who's doing that. I don't know who's thinking about that. But I do think that as we become more aware of the role of germination and flavor and longevity, I think that that's what I predict people are going to be trying to do. Are going to be trying to unlock and open the seed and then kind of shut it down, which I think may be some of the thinking behind thermoshock, where you're starting a process and then you're rapidly cooling it so that you halt it, so that you stop the process. I think in general, most of the talk about thermoshock is about flavor fixing and about either infusion of flavors and then kind of locking them in. I don't know about that. I think that maybe that's happening, but there could also be something with germination where they're kind of stopping those metabolic processes. I think thermoshock is really, poorly understood, or at least poorly explained to other people. Maybe people do know what's going on, but they don't know how to explain it. So I'm not that convinced on what's happening during that process of thermoshock, of heat treating and rapidly cooling. But I do think that it could have some implications with our germination. So to answer Paolo's question in a really long, windy way, and if this is your first time to office hours, this is kind of what we do. It's just a little rambly, I just got this is not prepared. This is not an episode where I've thought about this. I just saw this question, but it lets you kind of have an idea of my thinking and where this is going. So his question is, what exactly happens to the structure? I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm not looking with an electron microscope into the structure to see what's happening. But from what I know about this process of germination, it has to be different between washed and natural coffees. We are absolutely affecting its shelf life when we're affecting its structure, because the structure is what contains our aromatic and volatile compounds. So whether they become available to volatilize away and the coffee is fading, or whether they're like trapped in the seed and then maybe be able to be unlocked during roasting. I think that is, that's also, that has to be happening. I don't know how. I can't promise. Like I can't tell you how, but it has to be happening. Like those things must be true. And he mentioned this like mysterious drop in quality, and sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. My experience, my like feedback from talking to a lot of you guys and just kind of getting comments is that like 9 out of 10 times it does happen. Most of the time, these coffees that are treated in these kind of extreme processes do fade more quickly than a traditional washed or a traditional natural. But the fact that sometimes they don't, I think is interesting. But since we don't know how these processes are going and we know that we have like temperature limits or pressure limits, I think it's possible to do these like extreme sounding or extreme type of processing without actually being that extreme, without reaching like peak temperatures or without reaching kind of the limits, and doing a process that seems extreme but can actually be quite gentle and maybe not mess with the structure and kind of get all of the benefits without the drawbacks of fading. Like I think clearly that's possible. So yeah, those are just my thoughts. I don't know if anybody else has any experience with these types of coffees or has any comments or any of this. Yeah, Dylan.
Yes, I've been working on fermentation for many years. And about 6 years ago, I shifted towards the germination side as a driver of flavor. There's a fair amount of research already been done in the early 2000s. Flavio Barem spent a lot of time looking at the cell structure around drying, but there's a group of German scientists in the early 2000s, Gerhard Biethoff and Dirk Selmar and others, that did a lot of work on post-harvest processing and germination and a wider term of biological activities. But yeah, I've been doing quite a lot of work around for about 6 years now on germination and flavor development.
Cool. And what can you share with us when you say you moved from fermentation to germination? How does that look different?
I mean, so fermentation is part of the process. So when I first started in coffee processing, I started looking at how do we make it processing more efficient. So making it more uniform or speeding up the processes. So I worked with temperature initially. I did look at working with enzymes, straight enzymes like in other food industries. But what I found is that, and then in about 2017, I saw that there was a lot of interest in around fermentation. But what was happening in the processing didn't sound true to me. Like the impact, I hadn't seen what people were seeing. So I started looking at coffee being a seed and the impact of, like the simple way to look at it, there are the biological activities, but looking at germination as the key driver for changes in the compounds within the coffee. So fermentation is part of the germination. So the way to look at it, the way I look at it, is that germination is, or biological activities, but let's call it just germination, is the underlying current, like the underlying driver of flavor, but there are other things that are impacting it, and fermentation is one of those. And I've already done trials like what we call like A and B trials, or one yes and no trials. Yeah, the impact is much bigger than fermentation.
Absolutely. So Mike, I want to...
You can change the flavor quicker.
I completely agree. And I think that something to resaltar, something to highlight, sorry, my Spanish brain, something to highlight in what you're saying is that, you know, I think fermentation is kind of the gateway drug into processing, but I really want people to kind of, you know, graduate beyond that pretty quickly. I think fermentation is very limited in what it can do. I think it's really interesting and it's very accessible, but it's not the biggest lever that we can pull when it comes to flavor. So exactly what Dylan is sharing. I think that the seed metabolic processes have a much more ability to impact flavor than what we're doing on the outside. Because that's what I try to remind people when we talk about fermentation, is that we're doing something on the outside and then hoping that through osmosis, through passive like transfer, that some of those flavors on the outside are getting into the seed and that we're able to perceive them in roasting, which it's been proven that it does happen, but it's not as powerful as when the seed inside is changing, when it's having its own metabolic activity. It's just much more able to have an impact. So fermentation, what it can do is we have, again, high moisture, changing the acidity, kind of changing the environment. I think alcohol has a lot to do with the solubility of these compounds kind of coming in and out into the seed. So I think alcohol does play at a small percentage a role in that flavor development. But my question is more, Dylan, how do you encourage germination, or how do you pull that lever when you're processing?
So the way to look at it is you look at coffee, the whole lens to change is that coffee is a seed. So the first part is to look at it in terms of its fragility. So this is again from harvest all the way to green storage prior to roasting, and even looking at the time frame between them. But so you're looking at the physicalness of the processing. You're looking at you mentioned temperature during fermentation. You're looking at temperature during drying, which Flavio Barem covers in a lot in terms of the damage that drying can be done to the cell structure. He's got one very good paper that he talks on in RICO around the damage that drying can do to the cell structures, which obviously impacts the flavor of the coffee, because that's where all the flavor compounds are. But in terms of actually germination, so it's to consider coffee as a seed. So what are the drivers of seed development? So temperature is more of an accelerator or a decelerator. But you look at those things that drive germination. So yeah, there's probably 5 main drivers that are impacting germination, and then other biological activities.
But when you're saying you're doing an A/B test of, like, does this work, or what is the difference that we can perceive? What is an example of a protocol that you've run? Are you doing 2 different temperatures? Are you, like, say somebody here was listening and wanted to try it. What would you recommend they try for an A/B test?
So I mean, if you're looking at, so what I did initially 5 years ago when all these new fermentation named conventions came around, I did bucket trials and tested all of them against each other. And what I found often is that the flavor came out the same. So even though you do all these massive different variations in processing, the flavor actually ends up being the same. So then after that, I took the same batch, same variety, same harvest, and then just put 2 batches and then looked at germination. So, if anyone's worked in a coffee nursery, there's ways to speed up the germination. So, moisture is obviously maintaining the moisture content. So fermentation is part of that. But so if you look at you know what scarification is?
Scarification, you mean when it's like creating like a bud scar? Do you mean on a seed?
Yeah. So in scarification can be both physical. So in some seeds, what they do is they physically sandpaper the surface to break the seed coat. But fermentation is basically chemical scarification. So that's an example. Oxygen is another way. And then the opposite being true, carbon dioxide. So that's why I think carbonic maceration has a certain flavor profile, because it's kind of the opposite of oxygen. So the way to look at it, it's not necessarily, there's not, like you said, it's not a specific protocol. It's just understanding that germination is the driver, and then all these different ways are affecting flavor because they're affecting germination differently. So oxygen's another one, and there are others.
So
and
you're
then
saying when you're
time is
doing
obviously a big one.
your test and you're doing your bucket trials, the way that you would see the difference would be then you would see how many from bucket A would germinate versus how many from bucket B, and then you would compare that to your cupping.
No, so germination is we talking. So if you had to take like the traditional thinking of germination is when the radical breaking the seed codes. Let's say that's 0.10, which I've processed coffee to that level, just even beyond that, just for fun, to see what the flavor profiles are there. But we're talking flavor differences at 0.23.
Got it.
There's no significant like germination physically. So you can see slight changes in the embryo, lengthening of the embryo, the thickening of the embryo, but you have to have like you have to look very closely to be able to see those changes. But the flavor difference is stark.
Okay.
So, and that's where and again, this is even though I've been at it a long time, the difficulty and challenges we have in coffee is that the technology is not there. So it's bucket trials versus controlled processing. So, but I'll give you an example. So I grew up with SL28 as our main cultivar that we've been growing here for many years. And there's kind of, we over the years, you kind of get a sense of what the flavor is. And there's often two flavored, what I call like windows. So the flavor windows that we see and we experience over the years there's like two flavor windows. Is one's black tea and the other is a berry-like characteristic. And often we wouldn't know what the main driver of those because we followed traditional wash processing, but we'd get these flavor differences. So I was able to through just a standard wash method and looking through the lens of germination, find those flavor windows in the coffee. So same batch and be able to develop those two different flavor profiles.
And can you share with the group where you're at, where you're doing these trials?
In South Africa.
Very cool.
So our family been growing coffee since the early 80s. So our father and grandfather planted coffee in 84, but there hasn't been much of an industry here. So most of the work I've been doing is kind of like on an island. So I mean, reading a lot of books and that, but there's a lot of experimentation has been through the isolation because there's very little coffee in South Africa.
And does most of it stay in South Africa, or do you export it?
Most of it's roasted and sold within South Africa, but we work with a number of growers now, both in South Africa and elsewhere in Tanzania, Mozambique, and elsewhere.
Interesting. Victor, would you like to ask a question? Oh, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes, we can hear you.
A recent Standard magazine issue highlighted South Africa as an origin. So maybe we'll see the excitement building. I don't know if y'all read those, get those. That's probably one of those global north privileged coffee things. I've went to South Africa twice and I was looking for South African coffee and couldn't find it. I found some nice Ethiopian. While I have the camera, look what just arrived.
Is that your Sun Bear coffee?
You want to guess? Yes.
Yay! So Victor is sharing. This is our first live unboxing on our Discord channel. This is last year's coffee that Nick and I processed here in Guatemala. Look at how cute that is. So it's our coffee from here that made its way to Florida, and now from Florida to California, where Victor is. What? You're supposed to be describing it to us.
I know, right? Beautiful bag. This is, I honestly didn't even look at the size that I ordered. I just clicked buy. So this is a nut 12 ounces. That's a good amount of coffee for me. We've got the origin. We'd prefer if they said provenance.
Yes.
Antigua, Guatemala. Notes. Kadinsky. Minimalism. Immaculate.
I know.
I love it. I don't even know what Kadinsky is.
It's
It's a typo. It should say Kandinsky.
Kandinsky,
artist.
the Russian artist. It's like a
Oh.
abstract Russian artist.
Elevation. Boo.
I know.
Boo. Elevation. H1/Katura.
I want to take.
Lucia Wasp.
I know. I actually wish it didn't have my name on it, and I wanted to take a moment to, because Jason's here as well, and Jason had a question on a different thread about what should be on a label, or kind of moving forward, what to share. So I may pick on Jason if he's around to share his thoughts, but I'll start by saying that I had a lot of conflict with this coffee, like personal conflict with this coffee, because I've never wanted my name to be the thing that sells the coffee, but that's what that's what sells the coffee, and that's what people were looking for. So if it was up to me, I would love to not have like Lucia Solis on there. I just want the coffee to like speak for itself. Okay, Jason joined us. Jason, would you mind sharing with the group your question about what you'd like to see on the label, or just kind of give us your thinking about that?
Well, I'm just working through the process of what we really should be focused on putting on the labels. Elevation is something that I have learned through another importer that once thought higher elevation, better coffee, harder bean. But if you have good practices and you're paying attention to the health of your plants, you can have good hard beans at a lower elevation. So that's not as important. I know that one is not as important as it was at one time. And now hearing things that you have found, we talk about flavor, and so educating our customers, when we talk about flavor, we say you look at the process, you look at the country, you look at these different things, and we're finding that it's not necessarily the country that it's grown in. It's not necessarily the process. I mean, you talk about making a wash taste like a natural, or a natural taste like a wash. So things are really kind of being turned on top of their head. I mean, I can say, a varietal will definitely be pointing towards where your flavors are coming from. And the reason why I'm so focused on flavor, because that's how we translate to the customer, like what coffees they may enjoy. So I just ask, what can we put on the bag that will help the customer be informed, but also be traceable to where the coffee comes from?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that thinking, and I definitely think more people should be doing this exercise, both, like you say, because the landscape of processing is changing, and so producers are trying new things, and it's both kind of confusing for consumers to read carbonic maceration or thermoshock, like what should I be expecting? But also a lot of times that doesn't give you like what consumers care about, I think, is what it tastes like. And then maybe next is, okay, where does it come from? I think there's more of a consciousness of I should care where my coffee's coming from. And then maybe caring about, if it's organic, or if there's a certification, or if it's a, women project, or if it's an indigenous project, or, something a little more intangible that way than like just the flavors in the cup. So I would love for more people to be doing this exercise. And my personal take on it is not necessarily, putting more on the bag because of my minimalism. I think putting less on the bag is a good way to have maybe a conversation and get more engagement from your customers. And Jason, from the way that you worded your question, especially about the elevation of okay, it used to be a thing that meant something. Now we know it doesn't mean what we think it means. It's not as a helpful of an indicator to consumers. And having kind of that education of well, now we told them that high elevation is a thing that they have to look for. And now we have to unteach them or unlearn that is the indicator. And that's why I'm more of a fan of putting less on there, not for, I think a lot of people are like, oh, transparency, we want more information. But a lot of times, more information is kind of like flooding and it's not really getting the message across. So, something that I really like for when I buy coffee from roasters is having a really clear point of view. And I think that for you, whatever's important to you, what you have found with your experience makes a difference for the coffee. I think that's what you can teach your customers is important for the coffee. I don't think that there should be like a checklist that every coffee needs to include the genetics and needs to include the co-op name and needs to include the type of processing and just, having all of this like checklist. I think that that's what I like roasters for, is kind of that discernment and that point of view of like, this is what they thought was interesting. So now I know to trust them and go to that coffee. I think another thing I want to share before I open it up more to discussion is something I really liked that George Howell, I don't know if how widely it's done, but when I was speaking with him last year, his idea was like, he really likes coffee that tastes like coffee. And he's finding that a lot of his customers are either wanting to try something that doesn't taste like coffee or really like coffee. So he made coffee like his baseline note. And then basically he told people, this is how much this coffee tastes like a coffee that you're used to. This coffee is like classic and tastes like coffee. And then this other coffee is like 80% coffee and 20% something else, to give people kind of that roadmap of how much do you want your coffee to taste like coffee. And for me, I think that that's really respectful of his audience, and I think that's really interesting. And I mean, George gets away with a lot in terms of like his we give him a lot of runway, so we assume processes are he's paying good prices and all that other stuff that we just can't take for granted from everybody else. So I do think that it's important to have the producer's name. Like, that's what I like. I like to focus on what does this coffee taste like and who made it, and not necessarily, like I said, the process or anything else. Like, that's how minimalist I like to be. But again, I think that's a preference. That's just, letting the producer have more of that role, because if you like this producer, then you may seek more coffee from that producer, and they have their genetics and they have their style and kind of anything else. So I'll stop kind of rambling about my preferences, and I want to see if anybody else has anything to add about either as a consumer what you like to see. Lowell?
I had something to say about labeling, but before wanted to comment on what Dylan said. I think people that are at Origin and can talk to those folks who are doing nurseries, that might be, I mean, those are guys who understand germination pretty well. And then the second thing I would say, when he made the comment about using germination as your lens for processing, the protocol where you're resting your coffee before it reaches 11% moisture, I think is something that people should be paying attention to. I think I forget the name of the guy that you've been talking about with the drying, but he was talking about resting his coffee at like 15% moisture. And I think I've seen other protocols where people are drying slower. And I think that's just a way, and at lower temperatures, to protect the coffee from, damaging the embryo. And I think that goes to that lens of germination. So I think that's interesting, and focusing on when you're resting the coffee and how slow you're drying is probably very important. In the context of labeling, we've been working with a technology company called Bex 360, and I know a lot of people, I think, see the blockchain and stuff like that as kind of marketing fluff. But what I would encourage you to do is either look at Bex 360's page or a coffee company called Queen City, and they're in Denver. And what they're doing is we're able to, with applications, track the coffee from harvest all the way through the supply chain to roasting, and then they put a QR code on the bag. So all of that information obviously isn't going to go on the bag, and then it's just up to the customer how much they want to know, and they can click on that QR code, and you can kind of drill down and know as much or as little as you want about the coffee. But it has things like price transparency and how the coffee got from point A to point B, and all of that stuff. Is, I think, from a roaster's point of view, you don't want to be using information that you can't verify. I think you got to be a little bit wary of greenwashing, and so you want to, as a roaster, you want to be able to verify what you're telling your customers. And I think because it's using the technology company, it gives you a little bit of that verification and authenticity that you'd want. And so I would encourage you to look at that, because putting it all in the bag is or even in a QR code and letting people then decide for themselves. My hope is that someday, if you want to sell your coffee, you're going to have that information, and therefore that'll be the distinguishing, factor between coffees that do and don't look like they're transparent and fair. It's that information that sits behind the coffee. And then it wouldn't be a call if I didn't say something sarcastic. Once I tried the 7-day fermentation, and with the same objective of if it worked, I picked 7 days because if it worked, I was going to call it the God process. So I would really encourage any of the processors out there that if they can do a God process, I'd really like to see it on the bag. And if you could, ferment for 7 days, and then if you could infuse it with the Holy Spirit, I think that's the coffee I'd buy. So, and I'd like to see it on the bag. I'll
Have you
stop
ever
there.
tried having your tanks blessed by a priest?
Victor, what do you think we do during the workshop? I'm just blessing all the tanks.
It's a ritual.
Here in Santa Elena, there's a saint where when it's his day, there's a feria, what do you call that? Like a festival, and his name is Santiago. And there's a little statue of Santiago, and he sits on a horse. And you go in and you make a promise to Santiago. And so, like, my promise was to give people rides for free when they were asking for rides, in exchange for a blessing. And so I wanted to win Cup of Excellence. So it didn't happen, but that was my. I went to Santiago and said, bless me with the winning Cup of Excellence, and I will give people free rides every time I see them that they're asking. So
Okay, so clearly you need to
I've
up
held
your
up my end.
offering.
I said a million rides, which is clearly impossible. But there you are. So maybe Cup of Excellence is clearly impossible.
Thank you, Lowell, as always, for sharing. I really like this idea. I think we're getting kind of, like circling back, or like the pendulum swinging, where there used to be very little information on the bag because people didn't care, we didn't know about it. And so to prove that, specialty coffee is different, we put more and more information on the bag. But like I was saying, I feel like that's kind of flooding and like kind of signaling, and there's so much information that you can't verify. So because of that is kind of why my personal take is to do, that's a significant card that Victor is sharing on the screen, significant amount of information. And so because there's so much that you can't verify, my personal style is to just put less. So things that you can verify are what it tastes like to you as your roaster, as you're selling your bag. Like, this is what it tastes like to me, and then where I bought it from. So having kind of those two pieces of information, I think it's hard to go wrong. And I think that the blockchain transparency kind of information that Lowell is sharing, I do think has a role, because I also don't think we need to like shove this information down consumers' throat if they're not interested. If they are just trying to buy a coffee that they like, I think that's okay. I don't think we need to, force people to care about something that they don't care about, but to have it there. We're almost out of time, so I want to just quickly address Thomas's question in the chat. So Thomas asked, going with what Dylan was sharing, does this suggest that when I soak the fruits for 3 days and then drain and they're dried slowly, that the coffee seeds may have decided to try and germinate? So what we're saying is yes, when you have higher moisture and more time, the seed's natural, that's the seed's development. The seed wants to become a plant. So when you give it conditions like warm temperatures, high moisture, and time, then that is going to be a direction that a seed would like to go to. And then the second part of the question is, and then are there consequences of, and then the consequences of drying negate the efforts, leaving residual effects of the changed molecular in potential. I don't really understand the second part. Maybe Thomas, you can clarify a little bit what you mean with kind of the drying negating your efforts, because yeah, I'm a little bit confused. And I see some chats I see some people trying to type in the chats. Okay. Micah, would you explain the correlation between shading and the dew point? Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. So I have been sharing our process here in Guatemala, our drying process. And so we have a traditional concrete patio, sun-dried, and the nights in Guatemala are quite cold. So we'll drop down to 10 or 11 Celsius. And then in the daytime, we'll be at, 35. It's very hot. So we have really dramatic temperature changes. And when you have that dramatic temperature change, especially at night when the coffee's been really hot and then it cools down so much, then that dramatic temperature change creates that, the humidity being pulled out, like when you have a cold glass of water and you take it out in the heat and then it starts to sweat on the outside because that temperature change is too dramatic or it's too different. And so when we put the shade over the patio, at first we thought maybe that there's like dew in the atmosphere and the dew kind of drops down and can wet our coffee. But what we also found that's not really where it's coming from. It's not really a protection from like the dew dropping onto the coffee. It's more that our patio heats up during the day, right? We're absorbing hours and hours of sunshine and then the temperature drops. And so when we have the shade, we can like interrupt that dramatic temperature change just enough, even just a 1 degree difference. Like we can just retain some of that heat from the patio and keep our coffee slightly less cold, and therefore the dew doesn't develop on our coffee and we don't wake up to wet coffee. So anything that you can do to reduce that like dramatic temperature shift can help. So I've shared pictures on Instagram where you go down to the patio and the coffee right next to it looks like it got rained on because it's just full of dew, and our coffee right next to it is completely dry. And again, it's not that it's like a physical barrier stopping the dew. It's just that creates enough of a like little insulated pocket that the temperature doesn't create that effect. I'm looking at the chat. Sorry. It said C. Thomas, the seeds want to grow, but drying stopped it. But things already happened. The happenings have resulted in some nicer potential for precursors inside the beans when they go into my roaster. Okay, Thomas, yes, I think that's what's happening when we were talking earlier, where you are initiating a process of germination by having a nice temperature, having high moisture content, giving it time. And then when you're drying, yes, you're interrupting that process and kind of, interrupting the process, and you are able to keep those, metabolic processes. Again, I'm thinking about carbohydrates becoming bioavailable and maybe those carbohydrates becoming more available in your roasting so that you get more flavor development and more kind of expression. So Micah, yes, the shade is like a buffer zone. It creates, like, again, talking about interrupting, it interrupts that like dramatic drop just enough so that we don't create that dew opportunity. And then also, Thomas, yes, drying is interrupting the germination that you started by soaking your seeds for several days beforehand. So I hope that helps. If you have problems with dew, having any kind of a barrier will help you. Dylan, yeah, you want to?
Just a question. Is there any mechanical drying in your area?
Our farm does not have any mechanical drying, but our area of Antigua does have. So neighboring farms do have mechanical drying. It's definitely an option, but our farm does not have it. I think that I'm going to suggest to the owners that they really consider it as climate change continues. I think we're really going to need to have more more options. Yeah, I'm big fan.
I think this came, I think, sorry, Lucy, I think this came up a while back, where air conditioners or dehydrators are used, which is a very effective way without getting to the high temperatures of temperature that traditional mechanical dryers use. Has there been any experimentation in your area on that?
Yeah, I just worked with, I've worked with two people that have dehydrators, one in Panama and one here in Guatemala that have dehydrators for drying, and they've both failed miserably because I think the assumption was it's more gentle because we're just pulling water out instead of like blasting it with really high heat. So the assumption was I have lower temperatures and I have a more gentle like mechanism of drawing water out. But they were still drying the coffee very quickly. So they would both dry the coffee in like 3 days. So the rate of drying was still dramatic enough that both of those, two different producers at different scales completely killed the germ and their coffee just got like white. It was bleached and ruined. And it was really confusing to them to say like, but we're being so gentle. And it's like, it's not just temperature, it's also rate. So if you're drying too quickly, regardless of method, whether you're blasting it in a dryer at 80 Celsius or you're dehydrating it, if it's, a 48-hour drying process, it's still too dramatic for the seed to handle being dried that quickly. So I still think the method shows promise, but I think it's kind of like, I don't know. This is Christopher Ferrand's like analogies, like a monkey with a gun. Like it's like too powerful of a tool for the training that we have. And so it's not the tools problem, it's our application of it. So I'm still not super against dehydrators, but I think it's not working for a lot of people. And I will tell you, when I did have a conversation with Borem about he's developing a dryer. So he's developing his own, dryer with his protocols. None of his technology includes dehydration. He thinks it's it's the one that he's not touching. So he's still like using heat, he's still using airflow, he's still using like all of the other modalities, but not dehydration. So if that's any indicator of kind of the future.
Lucia, can I ask a clarification? Are you leaving your coffee on the patio laid out, or are you bunching it all up into a pile and covering it at night? Like, are you recogiendo, or are you just leaving it laying out?
So I have to say, do as I say, not as I do, because I really recommend piling it up and covering it at night, but we don't do that here. And the reason we don't do that here is not because it's the best ultimate quality, it's because there's no people to do it. Nick and I would spend 6 hours putting it, like piling it up and then drawing it out because we just don't have the manpower. So we don't do that completely from lack of people, not because I think it's the best method. So yeah, here our coffee is laid out and then we just put the shade over it and it stays completely spread as thin as possible, or as thin as it would be during the day. There's not a day or night protocol. I don't love that, but that is what we do here. And I'm managing it. And so, Victor's tasting it. We're able to like get away with it, but it's not my preference.
Yeah, because it would be better just to put it all in a pile and cover it up right at night, and you'd still have the heat of the patio working. And because that's what I see here is people pile it up at night. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And not only when you pile it up, do you have less surface area? So if there would be dew, even just piling it up would protect the coffee. But I think also having the mass together and homogenizing between having the seeds that some are at 15 and some are at 17 and some are at 12, like that piling up, I think is really helpful for homogenizing the whole mass. So yes, I really recommend to everybody if you can.
That's a super important protocol when you're drying on raised beds, because a lot of times people who just leave their coffee laid out on the raised bed, especially when it's covered in plastic, they don't think they need to at night it's protected, but it's not really protected. And then the other thing is if you have uneven drying from one end of the raised bed to the other end of the raised bed and you're not moving it all, it's really important to bunch it all up together at night and so they can homogenize and then spread it back out. And then also to protect from those cold nights. But yeah, I was surprised that you weren't bunching it up on the patio.
I know.
I mean, it's 6,000 kilos, man. Like, we can't push 6,000 kilos around every day. Like, it's just too much.
And that's perspective too, because I'm talking about, we work with farmers who are doing, 3 kilos in a raised bed. So it's completely, that's why we all need to be focused on, workflow at first, as opposed, like, if you have good workflow, you're going to have good coffee no matter what process you use. And if you start trying to if you mess up your workflow with wonky, processes like putting orange peels on it, you're going to mess up your coffee just because you're messing up your workflow.
No, I totally agree. And I think I've had a little bit of inner conflict in sharing because I'm sharing what we're doing, which is not the best protocols that I recommend, but it is the reality of how you have to do coffee at 6,000 kilos, with this much time and limited resources. So I do want to be able to show scale and the choices that we have to make. For example, another thing that we've had to do or kind of dealt with is we want to mix more because the lots are so large that they do need that mixing and homogenizing. But the more that we mix on the patios, the more parchment damage we're getting. So I'm having to choose between like the lesser of two evils. The more parchment I damage, the more I'm exposing my seed, and I don't want that. But then I don't want a completely uneven coffee where some of my seeds are at 19 and some are at 15. So just the realities of processing. We're a little over time, but Dave in the chat has asked a question to
Don't
Dylan.
stop.
What's that,
Can
Lo?
you not stop sharing, by the way? Don't stop sharing. I know it takes an effort to share and it puts you guys out there and vulnerability and all that, but from my perspective, I enjoy the stories that you put on Instagram
Oh,
and
thank
I
you,
learned.
Lowell.
So
And
don't stop.
I appreciate that
And the
because
coffee when you're making coffee in the morning, I'm usually making coffee in the morning. So don't stop sharing that stuff. I know it takes effort, but
thanks for sharing. Because I was thinking with Nick, I'm like, we're just kind of sharing similar things. I'm like, is this boring? Should we just like stop? Because we're like, this is the tank again. Look at the bubbles. But it is what we're doing. So I will continue to share. Thank you. But I want to give Dylan a chance to answer the question that Dave has in the chat. So the question for Dylan is, are lipids in the seed necessary for successful germination, perhaps as a storage mechanism for the nutrients that the seed requires? I've had some faded coffees that have been stored too long after processing where the chemical reactions, Maillards, etc., don't take place with the same intensity, and I wonder if the lipid quantities are significant. Dave says, never stop, Lucia. Thank you, guys. Dylan, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, often there's so many variables that are affecting the end result in the cup, including drying. And, that gateway of drying is often, it doesn't give a good example of what the wet stages are having. And often, what we find in poor quality drying, especially high temperature, full sun drying, is the damage that's done. You never get to taste what the processing has. That's why we've moved more to mechanical drying, more controlled, not necessarily low temperature, but more controlled humidities and temperatures. But the way to look at it is the coffee is made up of two major components: the embryo and the endosperm. And the endosperm is all that the coffee, the embryo is feeding off. So whatever's in there is getting changed. There are also enzymes in there that are changing those compounds. But if you've ever experienced the germination of a seed in a coffee nursery, what is most interesting is that eventually that whole seed, that green coffee that we roast, totally disappears. The last little part that you will see is basically it looks like the parchment sitting on top of the stem. But the last stage, you will actually, if you open that, it's the embryonic leaves, the first two leaves that are enclosed in that parchment, and the green coffee is gone. So that's just to show you, if you go right back to the first stages, all those compounds in there between the carbohydrates, the lipids, are all changing. How they change exactly is unknown, What does short germination, long germination have effect on the flavor profile? I don't see necessarily that it's good and bad, rather that it's different, it's changing. But the way we look at it is and it's far more complex than a 1 to 10 germination or thing, but it's finding those windows of flavor that are possible in each coffee. Still the genetics are key to the flavor. The genetics are the variety is the key driver of flavor, but processing and germination is a big effect. I would say as much as roasting is. That's like the big lever. Roasting a medium light roast has a big flavor difference, and germination or in general biological activities, because there are others, is what's affecting the flavor. But there's a lot of unknowns there. There's very little research in that area.
Yeah, I definitely want to also highlight or just, second what Dylan is saying about genetics being really important, and that fermentation is a small lever that we can pull, and that I do think that we're not paying enough attention to germination, and that drying, as like not sexy as it is compared to fermentation, that drying is a really key factor in quality. And I do see so many producers who spend a lot of energy and resources, buying bioreactors, buying microbes, doing these fermentation protocols, but they don't change their drying, and it's still hot and fast, and we don't ever really get to taste the results of what was happening in the tank because of these poor drying practices. So I'm also a really big fan of mechanical drying, just for that control element. I think we have this idea of, sun, natural is better. And nature's great, but it can still get really freaking hot on these patios. I'm measuring 55 Celsius, I'm measuring 60 Celsius, like really high temperatures. So the machines is a tool, and we can just change our protocols to not have those high temperatures and kind of to manage volumes. So I think that's another kind of marketing thing that we've, like on labels, when it says sun dried or raised bed dried, like that's a virtue signal that we've taught consumers that they should like these things, that this is a good thing, when mechanical is completely valid and can be used to great effect. So that's, again, why I think sometimes less information on the bag gives us more flexibility and kind of more, I don't know, we don't have to then unteach things that were wrong in the first place. You don't have to like double your work later on when you're like, oh, actually, elevation doesn't do that thing, or actually these other genetics are good too, or actually, sun drying is not all it's cracked up to be. Anyway, okay, Victor, last comment.
I know, so far over. The point about lipids was interesting to me, because we know, really dark roasted coffee, you see the oils on the outside. But wait a second, those oils are present in light roasted coffee too. They're present through the whole stage of production. I don't think we've talked about that much compared to like carbohydrates and other flavor compounds. And like rancid oils taste bad, right? So it would be interesting to know sort of what is happening in roasting, because you're not necessarily burning the oils during roasting. What could be happening to oils during processing or long drying? And how does the oil composition and quantity change between varieties and stuff like that?
What I've seen is less lipid interaction damage, like compromising in processing, but definitely that's like one of the first things that Flavio Borem showed, is that these high temperatures damage the structure and then kind of release the contents, and you get a lot of oils just available to oxidize and react. So that the drying part is where it comes more into like danger of having your lipids exposed and to become rancid and to have that kind of taste before it's time. You guys, awesome as always to hang out with you. We did a nice long session today. I think that goes because we've been so busy with harvest, we haven't had our regular catch-ups. So if this is your first time, this is pretty much what we do here. It's really awesome to have any new first-timers come and hang out with us, and I'll try to get back on a better schedule as we move forward, and as, like I said, we're getting through harvest. The comments are always available for you guys, these threads, like you guys can keep chatting without me here, but I'll try to be back Friday soon.
Couple weeks.
Not next Friday. Next Friday we have the fermentation workshop. So not next Friday, but I'll see you in 2 Fridays. All right, everybody. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.